Welcome to the Dr. Wyatt Show podcast. For developing a long-lasting, happy relationship is the status symbol to achieve, and following my 6 marriage steps is a path to help get you there. I'm your host, Dr. Wyatt Fisher, a licensed psychologist specializing in couples counseling. Today, we have a special guest with us, Dr. Lee Baucom, and he's going to be talking with us today on the sensitive topic of infidelity. So welcome, Lee. Nice to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks, Wyatt. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's an important one. So Lee, what would you like the listeners to know about you? What's your background? What got you into the field of helping couples? Whatever you'd like to share.
You know, we all have scars, battle wounds from history that usually routes us to where we are. And so my parents are happily married, but I watched an uncle who was married, I think 6 or 7 times, unsuccessfully, all the way to the last one. And my aunts on the other side were divorced a couple of times. And I watched what happened to the family. I mean, to me, it just rippled through 4 generations really of impact. And so that was my early childhood experience. And then while I was at college, I knew I wanted to be in the helping world, helping profession. And that just kind of routed me right into working with couples. So I did grad school training to do that work. And then since then have continued to do that as a relationship coach. I usually refer to myself as being a recovering therapist. And so I do coaching these days, really with people around the world. And that's been reflected in programs and books that I've written about topics on recovering relationships.
Yeah, wonderful. What do you mean by a recovering therapist?
So the statistics on marriage therapy aren't real good. And so I was taught the way those statistics show up. I was taught to do therapy and around areas that I don't think have proven to be particularly beneficial. And so I tried to find different ways of approaching that. And I recognized somewhere along there as I was doing battle with my supervisors that I tended to be more a coaching approach anyway. And I think working with families and couples particularly is much more of a coach orientation than what I was taught as therapy. So that's the short answer.
Sure. Good. All right. So let's kick it off. So I have 5 questions here for you around infidelity. And you wrote a book about infidelity. Is that correct?
I did. It's recovering from the affair, and it covers both emotional and physical affairs.
Yeah. What made you write that book?
Well, because it seems to be a regular big bump on the road for lots of couples, not every couple for sure, but for lots of couples. And so the question is, what do you do after that? Because statistically speaking, infidelity is not the marriage ender for everybody. For some people, it's a reawakening. And so I wanted to help create a path for people who realized that there had been infidelity, whether it's emotional or physical, but they saw something of value in their relationship and wanted to move forward with it.
Sure. Great. Okay. Well, here's the first question. What, in your opinion and in your experience, and you've written a book about this too, what is the leading cause of infidelity?
Yeah. So we're going to bracket out one group of affairs, which are basically the ones that fall into addictions stuff. You know, people who are either sexually addicted or relationally addicted. And so they just fall into that trap repeatedly trying to get their fix. So we'll set that off to the side because that actually is the minority. And we'll go with your question, what's the leading cause? And that is disconnection. Couples get disconnected. And so I would put there 2 big pieces. There is the disconnection, and then somebody doesn't hold the boundaries. And what's important about that is both people are a part of the disconnection of the relationship. One person did not hold the boundaries to protect the relationship. And so this is one that will kind of get, are you blaming me for my spouse's affair? And no, but you were part of a disconnected relationship is a fact. And so you can hold somebody responsible for having acted out. They broke the boundaries. And both be aware that somewhere along the way, their relationship became so disconnected that one person was willing to go try to find it somewhere else. So disconnection. And just to drop back and step, I call it a pause button marriage, that lots of marriages fall into that, where you hit the pause button thinking you're going to come back to it. and it's the kids, it's the career, it's whatever. And so they pause the button, not realizing that relationships either are growing or declining. There's not a pause.
That's right.
And so there's the disconnection.
Yeah, no, I resonate with that. And that's what I teach as well. The way I say it is the person who chose to break the marriage vows, that's 100% their decision, their fault to make that decision. However, the climate in the marriage that increased their susceptibility to want to make that decision is usually both partners' fault on some level. Yeah.
And there are disconnected relationships that both people still, either by opportunity or decision, hold on to the boundaries. They protect it, and so they don't put themselves in situations that are going to put them at risk. And they don't take advantage if that just happens anyway. So just because you're disconnected doesn't mean there's going to be infidelity. However, it raises the risk factor.
That's right.
Because humans are
you broke out there a little bit. What did you say at the end?
We humans are so desperate for connection. We're just wired needing that connection. And so if we start craving it, there's research that shows that when we have disconnection in a relationship, it triggers the pain areas of our brain the same way it would if you had an injury on your body. Our brain reacts as if we are experiencing physical pain when it's emotional, relational pain.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so number 2, what if the wayward partner is not remorseful for their affair?
Yeah, and that's almost always one point in the process of recovery. And not remorseful comes in a couple of different flavors. One, not remorseful, is being able to blame the partner and say, you didn't provide what I wanted or needed or thought I wanted and needed. And so you forced me to go seek that out. That's one level of not remorseful. Another level is having so much resentment that's built up over the years that you just aren't willing to go to that level of vulnerability. Then there's the other level, which is none of us want to admit that we made a huge error. And so their lack of a remorse is often shame-based. I don't want to admit what I did. And so, my suggestion is to recognize that that is a typical part of the process. It's not the end of the process, but it's typical for couples to go through that. And to in some ways expect that that's going to be the case. Don't be surprised by lack of remorse, and decide that what you're working towards is the accountability for where you've been disconnected in relationship, and creating enough connection that A, the relationship is now revived, and B, at that point, the person goes, yeah, now I'm feeling the remorse. And I often see that, it's often I got busted, I feel bad about it. And that kind of goes away. And then they're like, oh, let me figure out the reasons that I shouldn't feel this. And they, begin to not feel the remorse. And then as they rebuild the connection, then they get back to another place of remorse, which is actually a healthier remorse.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that sometimes people may not feel remorseful because they feel so calloused or disconnected or resentful. But when they start getting closer and feeling more connected, the remorse can become more acute.
And that becomes painful for both people to deal with, because that remorse often at that point becomes overwhelming. And then they're doing the reparative work of forgiveness and taking responsibility and apologies and all that kind of thing.
Sure. So number 3, what if the betrayed partner can't stop bringing up the affair, even if it's been a while and they've gone through an affair recovery process, but the betrayed partner just can't stop ruminating and talking about it and bringing it up all the time, and it becomes an obsession? What would you recommend to that?
Yeah, it does. And so I talk about this in somewhat practical ways, which is that the person who committed the affair needs to be willing to be as open as makes sense. I mean, to be very open, to be willing to answer questions, to be willing to be accountable to where they are, be where they say they are, and all those pieces. They have to be willing to do that. And then I caution the person who suffered the affair to be very cautious about the question they ask, because the questions we ask lead to the thoughts that we then are traumatized by and re-traumatized by. And we somehow, many people have become convinced that if they have every single detail of everywhere they did it, how they did it, all those details, that it will somehow make sense of things. And all it does is create those thoughts. And so, practically speaking, one of them is to be very cautious about the questions you ask, and to step back and just ask the question, why am I asking this question? Is this question going to move us towards resolution in any way, or is it just caught up in the details and the sordidness of that? And if it's the sordid details that you think something is going to happen with, to then ask the question, what would make a difference in our relationship? Not what's happened, but where are we headed? And so it's a shift in perspective. It doesn't mean you ignore. We've already established there was boundary violation and there was disconnection. We can move forward with talking about the important boundaries. We can move forward with talking about how do we restore connection, and that moves us to a better place. It's just the details tend to cause more traumatic injury than anything else.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And it is a balance, because when you are the betrayed partner, you want to hear like what happened. I can't move on until I hear what happened. But it's a double-edged sword, because the more you hear, the more you get stuck in the trauma of the betrayal. And so it's a really tough fine line.
And there's the myth there that I can't move on until I have all the details.
True.
That's not true. The details don't help you move on. Working on the connection does, working on boundaries does, working on, kind of reforming the relationship does, but those details don't do much to heal.
Right. Good. And number 4, what does it take to heal infidelity? What are the key steps in your opinion?
So there are a couple of different paths that are going to, lead us there. One is if the person who committed the affair recognizes what they've done and is remorseful and ready to move forward. And that's an easier process, because at that point you can be working on the apology, taking full responsibility, working towards forgiveness, and talking about what it takes to build trust. So I just kind of named a bunch of things there. There's the apology, there is the forgiving, there is the trust, and there's the reconciliation. And one of the things that I think is important to notice is those are 4 independent facts. They are 4 pieces that we think they go 1, 2, 3, 4, but somebody can decide to trust somebody even if they're not trustworthy. I mean, people do it all the time. On the other hand, people can refuse to trust somebody who has now changed their ways and has become trustworthy, and they refuse that because it's a gift. Either way, trust is a gift, and it's whether we're going to make it too cheap or too expensive, or make it what makes sense. So to be thinking about what is it going to take for me to trust again is an important end goal. Some people can forgive somebody but still not reconcile, and so that leaves out that last part, and still have gotten to forgiveness, right? Some people reconcile, never have an apology, never have a place of forgiveness, and never really trust again. And this still they do it. So it's important to be seeing those 4 pieces as separate stepping stones. You may not have a spouse who is ready to apologize, and yet you can still work on forgiving. In fact, I wrote another book on forgiving because of that fact that, there's a process you can go through to recognize that you forgive, not because somebody has asked for it, but because you do that for yourself. Right. And so those decoupling those, so you're not having to wait for a spouse to ask for forgiveness to go ahead and move in that direction. It may take a while, as we've already talked about. If they're recalcitrant, if they are shame-filled, or lots of other reasons, they may not be ready to apologize. You can still step into forgiveness, and it's possible that the apology comes way down the line. And so then it's a matter of working on, what is it going to take for me to trust this again? If the person still doesn't apologize, what would be the steps to trust? And the commitment of reconciling is saying, this relationship is still important, even though this happened. I find it interesting that, pretty much every religion gives you an out on the marriage if somebody commits adultery. And yet, statistically, it's lower than the general population in divorcing. So many people go, yeah, but I choose not to. And to go, I can choose to stay and work on this and make this the relationship that I would want. And it doesn't require an apology. If you're the person who suffered and you're waiting for that, don't. You just keep dragging that along. But that is a part of the full reconciliation that eventually needs to happen.
Sure. So what would you say to the listener out there who is hearing this and they're saying to themselves, I just can't get over the betrayal. I just can't get over it. What would you say to them?
And it's possible that is the fact. Not everybody decides to stay in a marriage. And so they may decide that betrayal is so big. I tend to try to look at the whole of a marriage, of what's happened. I mean, there's a lot at stake in a marriage. I talked about what happened with my family and watching the pain of that. And people many times have the fantasy that they'll divorce and walk away and everything's gonna be okay. And the interesting thing is they still have to somehow get beyond the betrayal, whether they're in the marriage or not. That betrayal is still a part of what they're going to have to deal with. And so they have to ask the question, what if I can't get over the betrayal of, am I going to get over the betrayal within relationship, or am I going to have to deal with it after the relationship? And, that's a bigger question. I think people tend to underestimate the capacity for healing. Most people looking back go, wow, I was more capable of that than I thought I would be. But that's the bigger question. You're going to deal with it either on the front side or the back side, but you're not going to get anywhere in life until you tackle that issue.
Sure. It makes sense. That's a good way to think about it. So last question here is, what would you recommend to couples to reduce their affair risk moving forward?
Yeah. So if disconnection puts you at higher risk, connection is what lowers the risk. And there are actually two things. And I used to do premarital work. If people were going to get married in about 7 different places and where I used to work, they'd have to come through my office for 3 sessions. And one of the questions I would ask is, so what if y'all decided about boundaries for your relationship? And they would look at me as if I had asked them, what are you going to do to live on Mars? It never had crossed their mind that was a possibility. And so being clear about boundaries is important, negotiating what that's going to look like. And so sometimes people tend to think that they need to set their spouse's boundaries. I'm going to tell you how you're going to interact with the world. And when you're talking about a partnership boundary, it's what you both are agreeing to protect that partnership, that marriage. So it's not I'm going to do the boundaries thing to you. It's, we need to talk about what boundaries we want in place to protect our marriage. That's an important piece. And that's
sharing power.
That is sharing power. That is, because and you see it as our boundaries. Yeah, that's right. It's our boundaries, right? Not you putting the boundaries on me. And so our boundaries protect our relationship of how we interact with other people, how we interact in the world, how we act in the world. And then how do we work to make sure that our relationship stays connected enough that we're nurturing that, and that we're not at a deficit for that we don't hit the pause button, that we recognize this is an important relationship to attend to. And that affair proof, no, but close to it.
Yeah. What would be like the top 2 to 3 boundaries that you tend to recommend for couples to consider?
So this is the interesting, it's my wife and I have talked about boundaries like, am I going to meet somebody for dinner or at a bar if I'm at some event? And the answer for me is no. But those are ones that need to be talked through by couples, because many couples have some different views on that. And so I think that the important question is, what are the situations that would make your spouse feel uncomfortable? And what are discussions you might have with somebody that would fall into your sexual attraction class. So, if you're heterosexual, the opposite sex. If you're homosexual, the same sex. What would begin to feel uncomfortable? What would friendships need to look like to feel safe? How would you interact with others in a way that would, lead me to feel unsafe? And that is the vulnerability piece of being able to say, it would make me feel unsafe if you did this. And to, again, sharing that power to talk about what is that really about? What's behind that? Because there are times when I watch couples who have never thought about boundaries and can't even think about how they would create that. But I've also seen them that make it so rigid that basically they have no way of interacting in any part of life that may even come close to, anybody else. And so they have to figure out what works for them. Those same rigid boundaries that I would see as rigid, they may go, no, those are perfectly fine for us. So I think those tend to be more of a conversation negotiation than some clear boundaries that everybody should adhere to.
Sure. No, that totally makes sense. I agree with that, because it does need to be sharing power where we're compromising, we're meeting in the middle on, I may think we need these boundaries, you may think we need those boundaries. So we have to negotiate that often to strike a win-win where we're both in agreement. Otherwise, we're not going to follow them. So if I feel like you're putting boundaries on me or I'm putting them on you, they're not going to be executed.
Right. And I do think that for a couple that has a good amount of connection, is fairly connected, if a partner says, this makes me feel unsafe, there's probably going to be a part of you that goes, I don't want to do that. So I'm going to listen to that. And maybe I need to explain a little bit about what that looks like to me, but I want to attend to that. If somebody feels unsafe about a friendship, for instance, I think you need to take that on and go, okay, how can we either make it safe or decide that's a fair thing? And again, that's a shared power, but it is based in what makes somebody feel safe.
Sure. Yeah. So you're saying the more connected you feel, the more sensitive you'll be to your partner's feelings around what would make them feel comfortable.
And the more connected you are, the less risk there is for those around, right?
True.
And so, if you're already feeling disconnected, a Facebook friend can feel very threatening when a connected relationship would go, it's just a Facebook, And so there are shades that come into there that are partly about the relationship.
And the other part I would add to that too, and this is something I teach in a separate, type of teaching, but it's all about, owning our brokenness, owning also our own susceptibility, our own vulnerabilities, in addition to, what would make me uncomfortable with you. Also for all of us, just to have an honest take of what would be vulnerable and dangerous for me, knowing how I'm wired and knowing my, where I might fall down or I might slip. I think that's really also important for all married couples or anyone in a committed relationship to really own your own tendency to violate the commitment of your relationship if put in the right situation with the right person.
Yeah.
And there's a quote I read once I really appreciate, and it said something to the effect of, the moment you think an affair would never happen to you is when you're often the most susceptible. Because that's when our guard is down. That's when we're not having any boundaries, because we think, I could never have an affair. That would never happen to me. And that's when we take the most risks without realizing we're taking risks, or we dismiss those risks. We think we're above the risks, and that's when we fall. So I think that's another humble approach to this topic too.
As I've talked to these, young couples come to my office, avoiding is a whole lot easier than recovering. And so if you're even edging on the side of caution, it's a whole lot easier to just avoid it than try to figure out how to recover. Absolutely.
Yes. Well, good. All right, Lee, any final words of wisdom on infidelity you'd like to leave with the audience today?
It's all about what is your level of commitment to the relationship and working through the difficult times. Infidelity it's a big blow to a relationship, but it does not have to be the ending blow. You can choose that, but you don't have to. It does reveal something about the relationship that is in deep need of repair, but that repair can happen. So don't get lost in the one crisis and decide that there's nothing that can be done. Plenty of couples do it. You don't have to normalize affairs to realize the fact that you can still recover.
Sure. Thank you for that. Yeah. And so if people want to connect with you, Lee, if they wanted to learn more about you and connect with you further, what are some options for them?
Since we've been talking about infidelity, my book, Recovering from the Affair, you can find it at theaffairbook.com. That's theaffairbook.com is just a shortcut, puts you to the right place on Amazon, but you can order it other places too. My podcast is probably the better place, just to, it's easy to get to, free to listen to. SaveTheMarriagePodcast.com, or just search for Save the Marriage on whatever apps you like to listen to your podcast, and you'll find.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. I appreciate all your wisdom you shared today and for sharing it with the audience today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Wyatt. Good to talk to you.
You too. Thank you for listening to the Dr. Wyatt Show podcast. If you enjoyed the episode today, be sure to click the 5 stars and leave a review. For more resources, be sure to go to my website, drwyattfisher.com. And remember, your marriage is alive. So if you care for it and nurture it, it will grow. But if you deprive it and neglect it, it will wilt and die. The choice is up to you. Take care.